As the tragic death of Mica Miller continues to capture widespread attention, the spotlight remains on her husband, South Carolina pastor John Paul Miller. The case has certainly taken a dramatic turn following a recent FBI search at Miller's home and his subsequent arrest after a heated altercation outside of his church. With authorities investigating the man who some speculate is at the center of his wife's death, we're going to break down everything we know so far about John Paul Miller. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Pastor John Paul Miller remains under intense scrutiny after his wife, 30-year-old Mica Miller, was found dead in a North Carolina state park in April in what authorities determined was a suicide. And to be clear, at the time, the two had been separated. And Mica's death, though, has sparked speculation among friends and followers of the case, with some questioning whether foul play was involved. Although, to be clear, authorities have consistently maintained that Mica's death was a suicide, that she died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And they also determined that 45-year-old John Paul was miles away in Charleston when Mica had died. But nonetheless, protesters continue to gather outside the site of the pastor's former ministry, South Carolina Solid Rock Church, demanding justice for Mica, calling for John Paul Miller's arrest. We do know that the pastor's home was raided by the FBI at the beginning of the month, though the exact reasoning for that, the findings, remains a bit of a mystery. We've been talking about it, speculating about what's been happening. And most recently, as we reported to you here on Sidebar, John Paul was actually arrested, although he was released on a $776 bond, for getting into an alleged altercation with a woman outside of the area of the Solid Rock Church. Part of that confrontation was actually caught on a witness's cell phone camera. Take a look.
Y'all. What's going on?
Yeah, so a woman can be seen chasing Miller in a parking lot, harassing him. This was a Justice for Mica protester. The woman has been identified as Sandra Karen, and she can be heard yelling at Miller, who turns back to confront her. And she told a local affiliate that Miller had squared up to her and tapped her on her hat with his phone. So according to police records, John Paul was charged with third-degree assault and battery following this. It's a misdemeanor charge, and he's due back in court in December, but obviously not something he needed given all of the drama and the investigation that's happening. But as we wait for more information into this FBI probe, how this arrest could maybe play into it, let's dive into the top details about Pastor John Paul Miller. And to do this, to help me break this down, I want to bring on somebody who has talked with me before about John Paul Miller. Actually had her on recently before he was arrested. I want to bring on former FBI and CIA agent, News Nation contributor Tracy Walder. She's also the author of The Unexpected Spy. Tracy, so good to see you. Thanks so much for coming back here on Sidebar.
Thank you for having me, Jesse.
So since last time we spoke, we were talking about the FBI raid or the FBI search. We'll get into that a little bit later. What we haven't talked about is the fact that he was arrested. What do you make of that?
I don't think it bodes well for him, obviously, especially, and I know we're not talking about this yet, but especially if the FBI raids had to do with his propensity for violence towards women. As we know, other victims have sort of spoken out, right? And so this isn't going to play well in terms of his, I guess, character. Now, granted, this isn't someone who he physically severely assaulted. I understand this is a third-degree charge here, but at the same time, it would go to show to his character of perhaps being hot-tempered. But at the same time, you could also say that somebody's going to snap when being harassed, right? So I could see this sort of playing both ways for him, if you will.
And I think in that video, they were suggesting that, the pressure's on you, the FBI is looking into you, and that pressure can mount. I mean, after an FBI search like that, I'm not too surprised that we sometimes see things like that. But I want to get into the history of John Paul Miller. And the first key detail I want to talk to you about, Tracy, is Mica Miller's allegations of abuse from her divorce filing from John Paul Miller. So what we know is that the two married in 2017. They lived together in Horry County, South Carolina. But then things apparently took a rocky turn, because according to those filings, Mica became suspicious that John Paul had been cheating on her. She also alleged that he was growing increasingly hostile towards her, threatened to throw her belongings into the couple's yard, looking out of her home, defaming, demeaning her in front of the congregation at Solid Rock Church. And by the way, this was the first time that she had filed for divorce, because as we heard from Regina Ward, this was Mica's attorney, she was petitioning for divorce a second time right before her death. So Tracy, I just want your take on this because we've heard Mica's family say that she was actually developed mental health issues as a result of her relationship with John Paul Miller. When you hear these allegations and you think of these claims and think about all that has happened since, what is your takeaway from it?
So 100%, I have no doubt in my mind that Mica was severely emotionally, at a minimum, emotionally abused, if not physically in other ways as well. So this is a woman who sustained, in my opinion, a lot of emotional and psychological abuse that has been documented throughout the course of her relationship. There is no question that that is going to take a toll on one's mental health, especially when the abuser, quite frankly, John Paul, is the head of a religious organization. That can become even more difficult in terms of her reporting that and feeling that she's in a safe place in order to be able to report that. And so she is shouldering all of that responsibility. And I do believe this is where people feel that he is responsible for her death. He may not have pulled the trigger. Again, it has been ruled a suicide, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but he may have paved a way for her to do that and suffer at that extreme emotional abuse, which I have no doubt that she suffered from.
And using a platform like the church to talk bad about her, that's the allegation. Does this divorce filings, do these allegations, do they become of interest to federal authorities? And again, it's a tough question to ask. It's an easy question to ask. It's a tough question to answer because we don't really know what the FBI is looking into. But do you think they look into these divorce filings?
So yes and no. And again, I don't want anything that I'm saying to come off as heartless or unsympathetic to Mica. I am. I think this is a woman who suffered tremendous abuse. But the reality is the FBI would not investigate that crime on its own. That's not the type of crime that the FBI investigates. They investigate crimes of a federal nature, which this is not. And so I do think perhaps if they can find this larger network, right, of him abusing women in multiple states, online, those kinds of things that have that federal slant, if you will, then maybe that will come into play. But in my opinion, the state and local government, that would more come into play with them rather than the federal government.
Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. And going back to the timeline, going back to this, so the two, John Paul Miller and Mica, they separated, we believe in September of 2023. Mica submitted these divorce filings a month after that, but unfortunately, the troubles between the two would only worsen because this leads us to another key detail, Mica Miller's claim that John Paul had her involuntarily hospitalized. So this allegedly occurred on February 8th, where in a police statement, Mica said that she was involuntarily hospitalized for 2 days, and she said that she had to leave her vehicle in a Walmart parking lot. When she was discharged on February 10th, she told police she returned to that Walmart, saw that her car was gone, and she believed that John Paul had fraudulently had her hospitalized and stole her car while she was away. So when police contacted John Paul about this, he told them, look, Mica suffered from mental health disorders, and that because the two were still legally married, that vehicle was considered marital property. It wasn't stolen. And John Paul also highlighted that these issues with Mica's mental health, that she would spend large amounts of money when she stopped taking her prescription medication. And so he took the car away so she wouldn't sell it. So Tracy, we have these two different competing narratives here. But let's say this is true. What would be the purpose of having her involuntarily committed? We've heard allegations that he was coercive, that he liked to exert control over her, but you're seeing this kind of alternative explanation for what happened.
I believe this is ultimate in coercion, right? This is someone who is asserting his power, who is asserting his dominance. And because you mentioned that they were still legally married, he can have her involuntarily committed. And that, in my opinion, is the ultimate in terms of gaslighting. Look, we don't know what went on behind closed doors in this relationship. We don't. Mica is not here to tell her story. We just don't have that ability. But at the same time, in my opinion, his story doesn't make a whole lot of sense just from a detective point of view, if you will. If he was worried about her, spending money and having these egregious spending habits, which actually can go hand in hand with mental abuse. This is her way of asserting control, quite frankly, over her environment. Taking the car away from her while she's involuntarily committed at a time where she probably couldn't spend any money doesn't make any sense. And so, in my opinion, his side of the story actually doesn't add up.
Now, while the bulk of this complaint, this legal filing, referred to Mica's allegations about the vehicle theft, she also made another disturbing claim. So this brings us to another key detail about the John Paul Miller saga. And this is when Mica Miller alleged that John Paul Miller was grooming her when she worked for him at Solid Rock Church. So according to the police report, she said that she had known John Paul since she was about 10 years old, that he had been grooming her ever since. And we actually had the chance to chat with Mica's family about this in a previous episode of Sidebar. And here's what they had to say about that.
He had his sights set on her from a very young age. I would guess probably 14 years old, 14 or 15 when we first came to the church. And he made sure that he kept her exactly where he wanted her to the point of who she married, what job she picked up after she was, 18. He got her married, and then he made her his secretary and his babysitter and his let's go to lunch person, and oh, you're so beautiful.
So Tracy, talk to me about these allegations of grooming and how this factors into this, because when we were on with Regina Ward, we were on together with her, this is Mica Miller's attorney, she seemed to suggest, because she had a little bit more information, that the FBI investigation may be larger than just Mica Miller. And if we're talking about an allegation of grooming, where do federal charges potentially come in?
So Ms. Ward was an excellent guest. I really enjoyed talking with her. And I think one of the things that really stood out was that she actually seemed to agree with me, quite frankly, when I had said that I also believed that these charges were much larger than Mica and either had to do with something with underage children in terms of perhaps pornography, grooming, those kinds of things, or some kind of fiscal issue with his church that crossed state lines. And she sort of nodded her head. Obviously, she cannot divulge any information that she turned over, but I believe the federal government's involvement probably lies with these grooming allegations, and that other individuals in other states and other counties, even online, perhaps, obviously this is all alleged, could have been a victim of him and could have been groomed. And if that is the case, then now we are looking at perhaps child trafficking, child pornography charges, those kinds of things. But again, I'm just hypothesizing. No one has been charged with any of this.
Right. Yeah, he hasn't been charged, but these are would be characteristics of things we could expect or things we've seen in other cases. And by the way, if you're wondering about John Paul Miller's criminal history, so we went on Truthfinder, which has results dating all the way back to the 90s, and all we had to do was put in his name and location, and the results were right there. In 1998, Miller apparently entered a no-contest plea in Horry County, South Carolina, to a charge of assault and battery of a high and aggravated nature. That is a pretty serious charge because it means Miller did some sort of great bodily injury to someone. He was given 500 hours of community service, was put on probation for 3 years. A 4-year prison sentence was suspended. In 2022, South Carolina court records indicate that Miller was actually pardoned for that. And by the way, Law&Crime, we partner with Truthfinder. We use it all the time to get details on the people that are involved in the stories we cover. But even if you don't work in true crime, it can just be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. It's one of the largest public records search services in the United States. With a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. And if you're interested right now, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. You just got to go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. Okay, but back to this. So with tensions rising in the marriage, Mica Miller reportedly took some drastic measures to seemingly protect herself from John Paul. And this brings us to another key detail in this story, Mica Miller's filing of a motion for a restraining order against John Paul Miller. So on March 11th, Mica filed this motion through the Surfside Beach Magistrate Court. And it detailed within this order, there are 3 reports of Miller allegedly stalking or harassing her on various days, including spamming her cell phone with calls and text messages, slashing her car tires, and even discovering a GPS tracker on her car. There was a bench trial that was held for this case on March 26th. The case was actually dismissed without prejudice, and there was no restraining order that was ever issued. But what's even more shocking is that John Paul Miller allegedly admitted in text messages to a News Nation reporter that he did put GPS trackers on her car. And he said that he did this not to hurt her, but to find out if she was going to a gun store. Tracy, your reaction to that?
Well, that's convenient, isn't it? Here's the thing. Most of us can track people's locations through our cell phones, right? I share my location with my spouse, and I'm sure other people may or may not do that as well. He doesn't need to put a GPS tracker on my car to be able to do that. So it seems very convenient and very specific, actually, that he is wanting the GPS on this vehicle for the sole purpose of following her to a gun store. If she wanted to obtain a weapon, yes, she could legitimately go to a gun store, but there's other ways to obtain weapons as well. And so that wouldn't have been, in my opinion, a foolproof way of keeping tabs on her. I believe he put that GPS on her car as a way to control her, quite frankly.
And that goes into the allegations that even if he wasn't responsible, well, if he didn't kill her, right, that he was somehow knew where she was continually spamming her with information, harassing her, and that might have led to her death. Again, that's just what people have been saying. That is an allegation put forward. That is speculation. There's no evidence, actual concrete evidence to support that. And let me also highlight this one more time, that the official autopsy report did rule Mica's death a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And to recap that, here's what we know happened on the day of her death. So on the morning of April 27th, Mica apparently left her home, was captured on surveillance footage, purchasing a gun at a pawn shop. She then drove to Lumber River State Park, placed a 911 phone call telling the dispatcher that she was going to kill herself and that she wanted them to track her location so that her family would know where her body was. She hangs up before dispatchers could really get any further information from her, and then authorities would later discover that she was dead. So Tracy, any reason to suspect something's lacking in this investigation? Any reason to suspect that foul play was involved? Because it can be very difficult to accept that that's what happened. And there might have been a lot of reasons for why Mica did this, but there are those who believe there's something more to the story. So any reason to doubt the investigation in any way?
In my opinion, no, but I do want to talk about the timeline because there's something that's always stood out to me. And this is obviously getting very, very specific and in the weeds, but I've looked at the timeline over and over again. And one of the things that bothered me, yes, obviously she's going to a gun store. Yes, she is calling 911 to give them that information. All of those things we have to recognize, right? We can't just not factor those in. But she filled her car up with gas. And I thought that was really interesting because, in my opinion, someone who is pretty intent on taking their own life, which she did over a couple of hours, right, engage in that behavior, wouldn't be necessarily filling their car up with gas. And so I would have been interested to know if she filled it all the way completely or if this was just a way to get her to where she needed to go. I know that sounds very nitpicky, but as an investigator, those are all the things that I would really want to focus on. Now, it's not to say they didn't focus on that. I don't know if they did or not. I'm not privy to that information. But that is the one thing about the timeline, in my opinion, that has always stood out to me. I know this might frustrate people. I am of the conclusion that she did die of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But again, I am also of the conclusion that I feel that this was a woman who may not have come to this on her own, that she was very much emotionally, probably physically and psychologically abused to be pushed to this point.
And we know what really got John Paul involved was that following Mica's death, he conducts this memorial service for her that was posted on YouTube. And it leads to another key detail, that John Paul's sermon about his wife's passing was a bit odd.
She'd get tourists to take our picture, and I say, okay, thank you. She said, oh no, this isn't good. Give it back to them. And they do it again, you know. But she told me that she was so creative. Everything she did was so creative. What's the next picture? What's the next picture? She'd stop. We'd be on the way to like a show or something. She said, stop, I gotta get a picture. I said, we're gonna be late. She said, I don't care. What's the next picture? Next picture.
Okay, so there was that. And then following Mica's death, her sister Sierra Francis applied to be the special administrator of Mica's estate. And in a sworn affidavit, she said that Mica had experienced abuse and violence from her husband. We actually had a chance to chat more about this with Mica's family in a previous episode of Sidebar.
As far as the legal side of things, I don't have, perfect details of everything. I'm just trying to pick up where Mica left off and make sure that justice is served and that we are able to remain over her estate and make sure that it is used or allotted in the way that she would have wanted it to, instead of just leaving everything with her abuser. Do you know anything about the FBI being a part of this investigation now? Were you told anything about that, what they might be looking into? So we are aware that Robeson County did come out and say that the FBI is involved, but as far as what they're investigating and the extent of their involvement, the family's not sure.
Okay. I wanted to ask you this, both of you, this. So look, the main argument, and it's being put forward by Mr. Miller, and what we've seen is Mica, they say, had suffered from mental illness. Do you know anything about that? Anything you could tell us about that? Because one of the things that Mr. Miller has said is he had this power of attorney set up for that reason. What can you tell us about what Mica might have been going through?
So before Mica married John Paul, she had no signs, no history, no indications of mental illness at all. And
why did she presumably agree to a power of attorney? Usually the person who sets up would have to agree to it and sign to it.
He had every way to control her, and he was very good at manipulating the situation.
And she thought that he would be doing the right thing. She wanted to trust that Mr. Miller Jr. was actually doing, until she got away from him and had more time, when she spent more time with us, to peel off some of those layers and realize what was going on. And then she started becoming herself again and got a job and everything else, and was doing fine and was happy-go-lucky self again, excited about the future, and which is something he did not like. He treated her like a piece of property that he did not want to trade or get rid of. Just very terrible.
And this brings me to another key detail. Mica Miller's social media posts addressing this alleged abuse, because in one of Mica's final posts on Facebook before her death, she uploaded a selfie that appeared to allude to her husband's alleged abuse. The caption on that post read, "When terrible, terrible, terrible things happen to you, you all know what I'm talking about. RFP, resting peace face." And she had even posted a video talking about this.
It doesn't matter what gender you are, abuse is abuse. And you are the bride of Christ. And my Bible says that he took all the abuse you could think of for you so that you didn't have to live that life of slavery and bondage and pain. God hates divorce, but why? According to everybody I've asked and the scriptures that I've found, it's because it hurts people. But does abuse hurt people? How do you think God feels about that? So I want to remind you, like a bunch of people have been reminding me lately, that I'm God's bride first.
And I do have to address John Paul Miller's side of all this, which is that Mica was indeed suffering from severe mental health issues, that he was doing what he could to save her. And a few days after her death, John Paul Miller sat down with an ABC affiliate, WPDE, for an interview, saying she had struggled with suicide before, and each time we helped her through it and took her to her doctor, and we got through it and everything was fine. And so this past time, it's still a shock, an incredible shock. And by the way, on the subject of mental health issues, it would appear that even if Mica Miller was struggling, it seems John Paul Miller was too, because this brings me to another key detail. His ex-wife had filed a criminal complaint against him, claiming he was the one suffering from mental health issues. So prior to his marriage to Mica, John Paul was also married to a woman named Alyssa Williams. The two were married for 16 years before they divorced in 2015. And she filed an emergency custody complaint against him, claiming he was a danger to the couple's two children. I'll give you an example. The complaint reads, "Defendant has exhibited increasingly unstable behaviors, failed to provide a safe and stable environment for the minor children during his periods of visitation, and has exposed and involved the minor children in incidents of domestic dispute and discord." Now I want to talk about something that's happened recently. So another interesting bit of information is that John Paul Miller apparently applied to start a new ministry in Myrtle Beach called Living Water Church. And the business license for Solid Rock Ministries, it's still active as of November 6th, although the website's no longer active. And just last week, movers were seen removing items from Solid Rock Church and placing them in moving trucks before driving away. The Solid Rock lettering was also taken off the sign in front of the building. Tracy, your thoughts on the timing of this?
Well, the timing is obviously interesting. This is coming right on the heels, right, of the FBI raid at his own home. And so I am concerned, curious, however we want to put that, and wondering if perhaps the search warrant should have also been served at Solid Rock Ministries as well. I am concerned that evidence may not be preserved because he is moving right to a different location, and that may very well be justified, and that he is moving and opening up another church there. However, I am concerned, obviously, about the preservation of evidence, especially because FBI agents came to his home. And, look, I think the way that we have to look at it with John Paul is this: Mica may not be perfect, he may not be perfect, but why is the FBI coming to your home? That's not something that they typically do. And so they have to have very good reason to do so.
And that was my final question to you about the FBI raid at his home,
Right.
which now remains kind of a mystery. They were at Miller's home for several hours. They removed a number of items, appeared to be computer equipment more than anything. And Miller didn't appear to be home when the warrant was served. So talk to me about, again, what's the process for this? Do you think this is related to Mica Miller's death per se? And when we can expect answers from federal authorities about what they found?
So I think I mentioned when we talked before that they purposely serve search warrants of that nature when people aren't home. We surveil people for quite some time before we serve it. Also, I think Ms. Ward discussed the fact that she had provided some evidence to help the FBI obtain the search warrant. I think it might surprise people how much evidence we have to have a search warrant signed off on, because people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. That's a good thing. We should have a high burden of evidence that we have to provide. And so my only concern is that I am not certain that this has directly to do with the actual death of Mica, because this is about 6 months now, right, since her death that this search warrant has been served. And I would believe all physical evidence by this point may be destroyed. However, the digital evidence that you had mentioned coming out with computers, flash drives, hard drives, those kinds of things, that's probably where the gold mine of information is. And that's where they might find some of that grooming behavior that we had talked about earlier. But that takes a really long time to go through. It's not instantaneous. And so if there is an indictment, I think it's going to be a few months before we see anything.
Tracy Walder, thank you so much for coming on, breaking down this saga of John Paul Miller and Mica Miller with me. Really, really, tragic, disturbing case. We'll see what happens next. But a lot of attention and eyeballs are on John Paul. Thank you so much, Tracy. Great seeing you.
Thank you, Jesse.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.